In one of the most shocking and heartwarming stories you'll ever hear, a millionaire decided to fulfill his mother's last wish in the most unexpected way. A story of unconditional love, societal judgment, and one final act of gratitude. This tale will leave you speechless. When a wealthy businessman decided to marry his terminally ill, obese mother to grant her dying request, it stirred controversy and emotions. What unfolded at the wedding, however, is something no one could have anticipated. Let's dive into the unbelievable details of this extraordinary event. John was a man of wealth, but his fortune wasn't handed to him on a silver platter. He grew up in a modest home, the son of a single mother who worked tirelessly to make ends meet. Linda was a large woman. Obesity ran in her family, and she faced countless health issues throughout her life. Despite her struggles, she never let it affect her love and devotion to John. Her weight was a topic of gossip and ridicule in their small town. But to John, she was the most beautiful person in the world. He saw beyond her physical appearance and recognized her as the woman who had given up everything so he could have a better life. Linda was fiercely protective of John, sheltering him from the cruelties of the world. She often went without so he could have new clothes, proper meals, and an education. John remembered the nights she would come home from her job as a cashier, her feet swollen from standing all day. But still, she would muster the energy to help him with his homework. It was her relentless encouragement that pushed him to excel in school, despite their financial hardships. As he grew older, John became acutely aware of the sacrifices she was making for him. While other kids were going on vacations or getting the latest toys, he knew that his mother was scraping together every penny just to ensure he had a chance at a better future. After high school, John received a scholarship to a prestigious university, a turning point in their lives. It was an emotional day when he left for college. Linda, despite her pride, cried as she hugged him goodbye, her large frame enveloping him in a warm embrace that felt like home. John promised her he would make her proud, and he did. He graduated with honors and quickly climbed the corporate ladder, eventually starting his own business. His hard work paid off, and within a few years he became a millionaire. Through it all, he never forgot where he came from or the woman who had been his rock. As John's business grew, he made sure to give back to his mother in every way he could. He bought her a beautiful house and hired caregivers to assist her with her medical needs, as her obesity had begun to take a serious toll on her health. Yet, despite all the luxury he could now afford her, nothing seemed to bring Linda the same joy as the simple moments she shared with her son. They would sit together in her garden, talking for hours about life, dreams, and the future. It was during one of these conversations that Linda made a shocking confession. She didn't have much time left. Her health was declining faster than anyone expected. She had congestive heart failure, and the doctors had given her only a few months to live. John was devastated. He had always known this day would come, but he wasn't ready to lose his mother, the woman who had been his entire world. It was in the aftermath of this heart-wrenching news that Linda made her final, shocking request. With a serious expression, she told John that her last wish was to marry him. At first, he thought she was joking, but the look in her eyes told him she was completely serious. It was a request that seemed absurd, even crazy, but Linda had her reasons. She explained that it wasn't about a legal marriage or romantic love. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to show the world the depth of their bond, a bond that went beyond the ordinary boundaries of mother and son. John was overwhelmed with emotion. He couldn't believe what she was asking of him. He knew that people would judge him, ridicule him, and accuse him of insanity. He pictured the headlines and the gossip. Millionaire marries his obese mother. The thought made him sick to his stomach, but when he looked into his mother's pleading eyes, he realized that this wasn't about what the world thought. This was about honoring the one person who had given him everything. For Linda, it was her way of showing that her son was the love of her life, the one person who had never judged her for her appearance, her weight, or her failures. It was her final expression of gratitude and love. After spending sleepless nights agonizing over the decision, John finally agreed. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he couldn't say no to the woman who had sacrificed so much for him. The news of his decision quickly spread through his circle of friends and family, and the reaction was swift and brutal. When John announced his decision, it sent shockwaves through his social circle and the wider community. His closest friends sat him down for an intervention, desperate to convince him he was making a mistake. They told him he was risking his reputation, his business, and his social standing. They argued that people would never understand his reasons, that they would see it as a grotesque act of madness rather than the tender gesture it was meant to be. Even John's business partners expressed concern, warning him that this could jeopardize everything he had worked so hard to build. But it wasn't just friends and colleagues who were outraged. His own family members were appalled. Aunts, uncles, and cousins, people who hadn't been around much when John was struggling, suddenly had strong opinions about his life choices. They accused him of taking advantage of his mother's frailty, of exploiting her for some perverse reason they couldn't understand. His mother's siblings, who had barely been in contact over the years, emerged from the shadows to voice their disapproval, accusing him of manipulating Linda in her vulnerable state. They couldn't fathom that this was her idea, her wish, her final request. The media frenzy was even worse. Once word got out, tabloids ran with the story, each publication vying for the most sensational headline. "Billionaire's bizarre marriage, a union like no other," screamed one headline, while another read, "Son marries obese mother, love or madness." The public reaction was a mix of shock, disgust, and morbid curiosity. Social media was ablaze with opinions, as armchair critics from all over the world weighed in on the unusual relationship. Memes and jokes circulated widely, and it seemed like everyone had something to say about John's decision, though few understood the true depth of his love and the sacrifice he was making. But through all the noise and judgment, John held firm. He had expected the backlash, prepared himself for the onslaught of negativity. He knew people would see it as something obscene, a disturbing spectacle rather than the profound act of love it was intended to be. He didn't care what they thought. All that mattered to him was the woman who had raised him, who had given everything for him. He wasn't doing this for the world's approval. He was doing it for her. The day of the wedding arrived, shrouded in a surreal mix of anticipation, confusion, and a tinge of disbelief. It was an unusually warm and sunny day, as if the universe had decided to gift a rare moment of calm for what was set to be an extraordinary event. The venue was no ordinary hall. It was the sprawling garden of a luxurious estate John had bought for his mother when his business first took off. The garden had been one of her favorite places, a sanctuary filled with the scent of blooming roses, the soft chirping of birds, and the whispering of the wind through the leaves. It was the perfect setting for a ceremony unlike any other. The guest list was a peculiar mix. Close family members who had reluctantly accepted the invitation, unable to look away from the spectacle that was unfolding, Friends who were still in shock, attending out of a sense of loyalty or morbid curiosity, and distant relatives who had shown up mainly to witness the drama. There were also media crews, their cameras discreetly positioned outside the venue, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bizarre event. John had tried to keep the ceremony private, but the sensational nature of the story had drawn public interest, making privacy nearly impossible. Everyone was there for different reasons, but they all shared one thing: a need to see for themselves if this unbelievable rumor was true. Linda, the bride, was the centerpiece of the event. She had spent the morning surrounded by caregivers and close friends, preparing for what was perhaps the most significant day of her life. Her health had deteriorated significantly by this point, and she had difficulty walking and breathing. But today, she looked radiant. She wore a specially designed wedding dress, custom-made to accommodate her large frame, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing white skirt that draped gracefully over her body. Her hair, usually unkempt due to her health struggles, was styled into soft curls that framed her face, giving her a youthful glow. For a moment, as she gazed at herself in the mirror, she felt like a bride, just as she had imagined in her youth before life's hardships had taken that dream away. When it was time for the ceremony to begin, Linda was escorted down the aisle by her caregivers. There were murmurs among the guests as they watched her approach. It was a slow and labored walk, but she moved with a dignity and grace that silenced even the harshest critics. Despite the whispers, there was an undeniable beauty in the moment. A woman who had faced a lifetime of judgment, now taking center stage in a ceremony that defied all expectations. John stood at the end of the aisle, waiting for her, his face a complex mix of emotions: love, sadness, and a deep, unspoken respect. He was dressed in a simple black tuxedo, looking every bit the wealthy businessman he was. But there was a vulnerability in his eyes that betrayed his usual confident demeanor. As Linda reached the end of the aisle, she took John's hand, and the two shared a look that spoke volumes. A silent conversation between a mother and son who had weathered every storm together. The officiant, a family friend who had known Linda for decades, began the ceremony. His voice cracked slightly as he welcomed everyone, acknowledging the unusual nature of the event while reminding the guests that they were here to celebrate love, no matter how unconventional it might appear. The air was thick with emotion, a strange blend of unease, curiosity, and unexpected warmth. People had come to witness a spectacle, but many found themselves unexpectedly moved by the raw emotion in front of them. The vows were next. John took a deep breath as he prepared to speak, holding his mother's hand tightly. He looked into her eyes and began his vows, his voice filled with sincerity and love. He didn't speak of romantic love. Instead, he spoke of the deep, unbreakable bond they shared. He talked about his childhood, the sacrifices Linda had made, the nights she stayed up late to help him study, and the mornings she left early to work double shifts. He spoke of the lessons she had taught him: kindness, resilience, and the importance of family. There wasn't a dry eye in the room as he spoke, his words resonating with a truth that transcended the unusual circumstances. Linda's vows were brief, her voice weakened by her illness, but every word was filled with meaning. She didn't have the strength to stand on her own, so she held onto John's arm as she spoke. She thanked him for being the best son she could have ever asked for never abandoning her when it would have been easier to walk away. She told him that this wedding was not about legal bindings or traditional love. It was about celebrating the purest form of connection, a love that had carried them through every hardship. Her voice faltered, and John squeezed her hand, silently offering her strength as she finished her vows. It was a moment that seemed to freeze in time, a poignant and heartfelt exchange that left the audience spellbound. Then came the exchange of rings. The rings were simple, nothing extravagant, just a small symbol of the bond they shared. As John placed the ring on his mother's finger, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, knowing that this moment was both a beginning and an end. Linda's hands trembled as she slid the ring onto John's finger, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It was a moment of pure vulnerability, a raw and honest display of love that cut through all the judgment and skepticism. For a brief moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world, wrapped in a cocoon of shared memories and unspoken words. When the officiant finally pronounced them as married, there was a brief, stunned silence, followed by a hesitant round of applause. It was an applause filled with confusion, disbelief, but also a sense of reluctant admiration. The guests didn't know what to make of what they had just witnessed. It was unlike any wedding they had ever attended, strange, beautiful, and heartbreakingly sad all at once. Some of them wiped away tears they didn't expect to shed, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure how to react. John led his mother to the center of the garden for their first dance. There was no upbeat pop song or romantic ballad. Instead, they danced to a soft instrumental piece that had been one of Linda's favorites. She leaned heavily on John, her body weak and frail, but he held her up, moving slowly and carefully as they swayed together. It wasn't a dance filled with grace or elegance. It was awkward and clumsy, but it was also full of love. As they moved together, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden. The light filtered through the trees, illuminating Linda's face, which was filled with a peaceful smile. By the time the dance ended, there wasn't a person in the garden who wasn't affected by the scene. Even the most cynical guests were quiet, their skepticism softened by the palpable love between mother and son. It was a moment that transcended judgment, a rare glimpse into a relationship so pure and unconditional that it defied explanation. In that instant, the controversies and headlines didn't matter. All that mattered was the love that had brought them to this point, a love that had survived everything the world had thrown at them. As the evening drew to a close, the guests began to leave, many of them lost in their own thoughts. They had come expecting a scandal, a spectacle to gossip about, but they left with something entirely different. A story that touched their hearts and made them question their own ideas about love and family. John and Linda stayed in the garden long after everyone had gone, sitting together in silence, watching the stars appear in the sky. It was a moment of peace, a quiet end to a day filled with chaos and emotion. John held his mother's hand, knowing that this was likely one of their last moments together, and he wanted to savor every second of it. As the ceremony neared its conclusion, the guests were still processing the surreal nature of what they had witnessed. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the garden, creating an almost magical ambience. It was a moment suspended in time, beautiful, haunting, and filled with an emotional intensity that had taken everyone by surprise. John, standing with his mother in front of their closest friends and family, looked like a man on the verge of breaking. He had held himself together throughout the ceremony, despite the whispers, the judgmental glances, and the weight of the day's significance. But now, as he prepared to say his final words, there was a palpable shift in the air. John took a deep breath, holding his mother's hand as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. He began to speak, thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging the unusual nature of the event and the confusion it might have caused. He spoke slowly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He expressed his gratitude to those who had supported them, those who had chosen love over judgment, and even to those who had come despite their reservations. He explained that this day was not just a ceremony. It was a testament to a life shared between mother and son, a final chapter in a story that had been filled with both immense hardships and incredible love. Just as John was about to continue, Linda gently tugged on his hand. He turned to look at her, and in that moment, the world seemed to fade away. Her face was serene, her eyes soft, yet filled with a profound sadness. She leaned closer to him, her frail body trembling slightly, and whispered something in his ear. Whatever she said made John's expression change instantly. His face crumpled as if he had been struck by a wave of emotion he couldn't contain. He stepped back, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, and raised a hand to his mouth as he tried to steady his breathing. The guests, who'd been watching quietly, sensed that something had shifted. The atmosphere, already heavy with emotion, now felt electric with tension. There was a collective intake of breath, a moment of silence as everyone waited to see what would happen next. John, visibly shaken, turned back to face the crowd, his hand still gripping his mother's as if it were a lifeline. He swallowed hard, trying to compose himself, but the tears were now streaming down his face. With a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he began to speak again, this time with a vulnerability that took everyone by surprise. He told the audience that there was something he needed to share, something he hadn't planned on revealing, but felt compelled to after what his mother had just whispered to him. He paused, struggling to find the words, and the silence in the garden was deafening. He looked at his mother again, her face a picture of quiet resolve, and then turned back to the crowd. "This wedding," John said, his voice breaking, "was never about a marriage. It was never about a legal bond or some kind of romantic relationship. It was about something much deeper, something that I don't think even I fully understood until just now." He took a deep breath, wiping his eyes. "My mother's final wish wasn't to marry me because she wanted a wedding or because she needed me to prove my love for her. It was because she wanted to teach me, and all of us, a lesson about love, about life, and about letting go." The guests exchanged confused looks, unsure of what John meant. He continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "She knew her time was limited," he said, glancing at Linda, who nodded slowly. "She knew that I've spent my entire life trying to make her proud, trying to give back everything she sacrificed for me. And she knew that I've been afraid, terrified really, of what life would be like without her. This wedding was her way of making me confront that fear, of forcing me to face the reality that she won't always be here." John's words hung in the air, and for a moment it felt as though the entire garden was holding its breath. He turned to his mother, his expression filled with an indescribable mixture of love, gratitude, and sorrow. "She told me just now," he continued, his voice shaking, "that her final wish wasn't really to marry me. It was to give me permission to move on, to let me know that it's okay for me to live my life fully, even after she's gone." The realization of what he was saying hit the audience like a wave. There were gasps, muffled sobs, and the sound of tissues being pulled from pockets and purses. John's tears fell freely now, but he didn't bother to wipe them away. He held his mother close, his arms around her as if he were trying to memorize the feel of her, to hold onto this moment for as long as he could. Linda, for her part, looked peaceful, her eyes closed as she leaned into her son's embrace. It was as if a great burden had been lifted from her, a sense of calm washing over her now that she had finally said what she needed to say. The officiant, who had been standing to the side, seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He cleared his throat, visibly moved, and attempted to continue the ceremony, but the formalities now felt almost trivial in light of what had just been revealed. He stepped back, giving the mother and son a moment to themselves, understanding that the real ceremony had already taken place in that whispered exchange, a final, profound connection that transcended anything he could say. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in a soft golden twilight, John led his mother to a nearby bench. The guests, unsure whether to stay or leave, watched in silence, many of them crying openly now. It was a rare sight, a room full of people who had come to witness what they thought would be a grotesque spectacle, now humbled and deeply moved by the raw, genuine display of love they had just seen. John knelt in front of his mother, holding her hands in his as he spoke softly to her. They shared quiet words that no one else could hear, a final private conversation between two people who had been everything to each other. Linda's breathing was shallow, her face pale and lined with exhaustion, but she smiled at him, a smile that seemed to hold a lifetime of love and memories. Eventually, the officiant stepped forward one last time, gently placing a hand on John's shoulder. He spoke the words of blessing, his voice thick with emotion, and then stepped back, signaling the end of the ceremony. The guests began to disperse slowly, many of them lingering to offer their condolences, not for the wedding, but for the unspoken farewell they all now understood was taking place. John didn't move from his mother's side. He stayed with her long after the last guest had left, the garden now quiet and bathed in moonlight. It was just the two of them, as it had been so many times before. He held her hand, whispering stories from his childhood, reminding her of moments they had shared, the happy memories that had defined their lives together. Linda listened, her eyes fluttering closed, her breathing growing softer with each passing moment. It was there, in the stillness of the garden, under the light of the moon, that Linda took her final breath. Her hand slipped from John's, her face peaceful, almost as if she was simply falling asleep. John sat there for a long time, holding her, the silence around him broken only by the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. He knew that this was the moment she had prepared him for, the moment she had orchestrated with this unusual wedding. It was her final gift to him, a chance to say goodbye in a way that would leave him with closure, not regret. In the end, John realized that the wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was a lesson in love, in sacrifice, and in the courage it takes to let go. After the sun had set and the guests had left, the garden lay empty, silent and peaceful, as if it were holding its breath in reverence for what had just happened. The news of the wedding had already spread far and wide, with journalists, bloggers, and social media influencers scrambling to capture the story. Within hours, images of John holding his mother's frail hand, the tearful vows, and the final dance began circulating online. Headlines ranged from the lurid to the heartfelt, each trying to outdo the other in sensationalism. But amid the chaos of public opinion, something unexpected started to happen. The initial reactions had been predictably cynical. Social media was abuzz with mocking comments and disparaging jokes. People called it everything from the most disturbing wedding of the year to a publicity stunt of grotesque proportions. memes spread like wildfire, painting John as a man who had lost his mind and Linda as a woman desperate for attention. Yet, as more details of the story emerged, the narrative began to shift. The raw footage of John's tearful revelation, where he shared the true reason behind the ceremony, began circulating. People saw the sincerity in his voice, the grief in his eyes, and the love that transcended the bizarre context of the event. Slowly, the tide of public opinion began to turn. Soon, the ridicule was replaced with something else: empathy. People started to share their own stories of love and loss, of parents they had watched slip away, of final wishes they had fulfilled despite the judgment of others. It was as if the story had opened a door, allowing a flood of collective grief and unspoken love to pour out. Comment sections that had once been filled with mockery now became spaces of vulnerability and connection. Strangers from around the world left messages of support for John, telling him how his story had moved them, how it had made them call their own parents, made them think about their own relationships differently. The media, sensing the change in the public's mood, adjusted its approach. Articles that had once mocked the wedding began to delve deeper into the emotional story behind it. Journalists interviewed friends and family who had witnessed the event, who spoke about the bond between John and Linda, a bond that had been obvious to anyone who knew them. They talked about how Linda had struggled her entire life, not just with her weight, but with the judgment and isolation that came with it. They painted a picture of a woman who had faced every challenge with grace and humor, who had dedicated herself entirely to her son, and who had, in her final act, orchestrated a lesson in unconditional love. As the story continued to unfold, it went viral in a way that no one had expected. It wasn't just a story about a wedding anymore. It became a narrative about the universal experience of losing a parent, of confronting mortality, and of the lengths we go to honor the people we love. Talk shows and podcasts discussed the event at length, exploring the deeper themes it had brought to light. Psychologists weighed in, talking about the symbolic nature of the wedding and how it represented a final act of closure for both mother and son. It was an unusual, almost surreal form of grief therapy, played out in public but resonating on a deeply personal level for many. John, now alone in the house he had bought for his mother, was inundated with messages of support. He read every single one, often through tears, finding comfort in the stories that people shared with him. He had been prepared for a backlash, for ridicule and scorn, but he had not been prepared for this outpouring of empathy. It was as if the world had collectively paused for a moment, setting aside its cynicism to acknowledge the rawness of his pain and the purity of his love. Linda's funeral was a quiet affair, attended only by close family and a handful of friends who had been there at the wedding. John had insisted on keeping it private, a stark contrast to the public spectacle that the wedding had become. He chose a simple ceremony, held in the same garden where they had shared their final dance. The officiant who had presided over the wedding spoke again, this time with a eulogy that was more of a love letter to a mother who had defied convention in her final days. He talked about Linda's strength, her humor, and her unyielding love for her son, describing her as a woman who had always lived on her own terms, right up until the very end. As the service ended, John stayed behind after everyone else had left. He sat by his mother's grave, the freshly turned earth still damp and dark, and spoke to her as if she was sitting right beside him. He told her everything he hadn't had a chance to say. His regrets, his gratitude, his fears about the future without her. He sat there for hours, long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, speaking softly into the night. It was a cathartic release, the kind of conversation he wished he could have had with her when she was still alive, but one that he hoped she could hear wherever she was now. In the days and weeks that followed, John found himself grappling with an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The house felt unbearably quiet without his mother's presence. He wandered through the rooms she had once filled with her laughter, her voice, and her warmth, feeling like a stranger in a place that had once been a home. The reality of her absence hit him in waves, each one stronger than the last, leaving him gasping for breath. Yet in the midst of his grief, there were moments of clarity. Moments where he felt her presence so strongly that he almost believed she was still there, guiding him, comforting him. It was during one of these quiet, introspective moments that John made a decision. He realized that the lesson his mother had tried to teach him wasn't just about letting go. It was about living fully, about embracing the life she'd fought so hard to give him. He knew that he couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by memories that both comforted and suffocated him. So, he sold the estate and used the money to start a foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting single mothers and providing resources for those struggling with obesity and health issues, causes that had defined Linda's life. The foundation became his way of keeping her spirit alive, of honoring her legacy in a way that went beyond a gravestone or a photograph. It gave him a new sense of purpose, a way to channel his grief into something positive, something that could help others in the way his mother had always helped him. He threw himself into the work, meeting with struggling mothers, listening to their stories, and offering the kind of support that Linda had needed but never received. As the years passed, the story of John and Linda became a kind of urban legend, a tale that was retold in articles, documentaries, and podcasts as an example of the extraordinary lengths people go for love. People continued to reach out to John even years later, sharing how his story had changed their perspective, how it had made them call their own parents or reconsider their own relationships. It became a touchstone for discussions about unconventional love, about grief, and about the complicated, messy beauty of the parent-child relationship. John, now older and greyer, often found himself reflecting on that fateful day in the garden. He realized that the wedding had been more than just a final wish. It had been his mother's parting gift to him, a chance to say goodbye in a way that left no room for regret. It had forced him to confront his own fears, to break through the walls he had built around his heart, and to step into a future where he could carry her memory with love instead of sorrow. In the end, John didn't remember the headlines, the controversy, or the jokes. What stayed with him were the small, quiet moments, the feel of his mother's hand in his, the way her eyes had softened when she looked at him during the ceremony, and the peaceful smile she had worn as they danced together one last time. It was in these memories that he found his solace, the proof that he had made the right choice, that he had honored her in the way she deserved. He had given her the send-off she wanted, a celebration of love that defied convention, a legacy that would live on long after both of them were gone. And in doing so, he had learned the most important lesson of all: that love, in its purest form, is never something to be ashamed of, no matter how strange or unconventional it may appear to the rest of the world. It is the only thing that truly endures, the only thing that transcends life and death.